Hey, and welcome to Post Edit. Now, in today's episode, we are going to be talking about compressors, limiters, and gates. Now, whereas, we said that EQs are probably the most used audio processors in the industry. Well, these would probably be the second. Now, as far as compression is concerned, don't get it mixed up with file compression or encoding. That's entirely different. What compression in this case is short for is actually dynamic range compression, which, as the name implies, deal with compression of the dynamic range. And really, another word for the dynamic range is volume. If you take the loudest point, so the highest point of, let's say, your song or your audio file, and the lowest, which is the quietest point, what you have in between there is your dynamic range. Let's say the greater the difference between the 2 points, the more great is your dynamic range. And what these tools allow you to do, what compressors, gates, and limiters allow you to do, is to control these points and make sure that you have a much more even sound, a much more full sound. What you're basically doing is you're taking the highest points of the song and saying, if anything passes above this point, the point that you set on your compressor, bring the volume down. And what this allows you to do is, have a more uniform sound, a more rich sounding file, and then raise your levels back up. Let me give you an example. Let's say, you're sitting at home, you're watching a movie, and action movies are horribly guilty of this. You turn up the volume so you can hear the dialogue. And then 10 seconds later, you're frantically scrambling to lower it again because a car just exploded, and you're trying to not wake up the parents and the dog 2 houses down. The reason for that is because movies generally tend to be completely uncompressed, so you have this huge dynamic range. And these movies are generally mixed for movie theaters, but they're not really mixed for a home audio release. But at the other end of the spectrum, look at pretty much any pop song or rock song or music that's been released in the past 2 decades or so. It's heavily compressed. And the reason I brought this up is if you take a look at the waveform on the side, there's actually been a Beatles song that's been released and re-released over the years. And as you can see, with each release, the waveform gets more and more even, because more and more compression is applied by the audio engineer each time. Now, with limiters, there's not that much of a difference between compressors and limiters. In fact, the limiter is essentially just a compressor with really high settings. Whereas a compressor will limit the dynamic range in a sort of curve that you can set, saying, if a volume is at this point, reduce it by this much. If a volume is at this point, reduce it by this much. A limiter, and pretty much especially a brick wall limiter, is just a line. And it's saying that nothing gets above this line. And anything that hits that gets pulled back down. So a limiter it has a much more drastic effect, where a compressor is more kind of for massaging the audio, whereas limiter is like a cut. Now, whereas limiters and compressors are concerned with the top end of the dynamic range, gates work on the bottom end. So whereas with a limiter you set a certain line, is saying nothing gets above this line. With gates, you're doing the exact same thing on the bottom, except you're saying anything that's below this line either gets reduced in volume or gets muted altogether. And what this does is it helps clear up your audio. So you'd have your gates before your compressor. And let's say you're recording a vocal track. Your actor's speaking. Anytime he pauses, the gate kicks in because the volume is not there, and all your room tone and your background noise is cut. So you'd have this before your compressor, that way you're not raising the volume on the noise.